pleasant day to the young and enthusiastic learners. I am Dr. Shobha Edward, Principal, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Corporate Secretaryship, KCS Kasinada College of Arts and Science, here to present on residential status. So when we move on to residential status, it depends on the number of days an individual physically stays in India. Residential status of a person depends on the number of days an individual physically stays in India. So residential status for different types of persons like individual, HUF, firm, company, AOP, body of individuals, local authority, artificial judicial person, for all of them it is determined differently. So residential status depends on the number of days a person stays in India. So when we move on to the residential status, for an individual, company, AOP, body of individuals, HUF, we have non-resident, ordinarily resident, not ordinarily resident. When we move on to a firm, local authority, artificial judicial person, we just have a resident and a non-resident. So for an individual, it can be a resident, a non-resident, and if it is a resident, it can be ordinarily resident or not ordinarily resident. And if it is a non-resident, he is a non-resident. But for a firm, a local authority or other artificial judicial person, there is only two classifications, resident and non-resident. So while deciding on the residential status of an individual, we come across basic conditions. So when we move on to the basic conditions, there are two basic conditions. What they are: stay in India during the previous year for at least 182 days. So our previous year is 2019-20. Our previous year started on 1st April 2019 and it ends on 31st March 20. So when you decide on the residential status of an India, the first basic condition, he should have stayed in India during the previous year for at least 182 days. And the second basic condition, stay in India for at least 60 days in the previous year and 365 days in 4 years preceding the previous year, prior to the previous year. So in the previous year, that is 2019-20, in the previous year, he should have been in India for at least 60 days. And in 4 years before the previous year, that is leaving out 2019-20, that is 2018-19, 2017-18, 16-17, 15-16. In those 4 years, he should have been here for at least 365 days. So all 4 years together, he should have been here for at least 365 days. So the first basic condition, stay in India for at least 182 days in the previous year. The second basic condition, stay in India for at least 60 days in the previous year and 365 days in 4 years prior to the previous year. So for an individual to be a resident, he should satisfy any one of the basic conditions. So even if he satisfies the first basic condition, he becomes a resident. Or if he does not satisfy the first basic condition, we will try out the second basic condition. Stay in India for 60 days in the previous year and 365 days in 4 years prior to the previous year. So if he satisfies the second basic condition, he becomes a resident. So to become a resident, a person has to satisfy at least one basic condition. So it can be either basic condition 1 or basic condition 2. So who is a non-resident? A person who does not fulfill any of the basic conditions. Both the first basic condition of stay in India for at least 182 days in the previous year, he does not fulfill that condition. And if he does not fulfill the second basic condition of 60 days in the previous year and 365 days in 4 years prior to the previous year, in both the situations when he does not fulfill the two basic conditions, he becomes a non-resident. So for determining the residential status of an individual, he has to pass the litmus test of two broad situations. First, we are testing the two basic conditions, and after testing the basic conditions, if he satisfies one condition, he becomes a resident. Now we move on to testing the additional conditions. So if he is an individual or HAF, at least one of the two basic conditions he should be fulfilling, and if he fulfills, we move on to the next two additional conditions. So the additional conditions, again we have two additional conditions. They are resident in India for at least 2 out of 10 years prior to the previous year, and the second additional condition, stay in India for at least 730 days in 7 years prior to the previous year. So once a person fulfills one basic condition, we go on to checking the additional conditions. And when it comes to additional conditions, if he fulfills both the additional conditions, he becomes ordinarily resident. If he does not fulfill any one of the additional condition also, he becomes not ordinarily resident. By fulfilling the basic condition, he becomes resident, and if he fulfills both the additional conditions, he is ordinarily resident. If he does not fulfill any one or both, he becomes not ordinarily resident. So the additional conditions, I repeat: resident in India for at least 2 out of 10 previous years preceding the previous year, stay in India for at least 730 days in 7 years prior to the previous year. So leaving out the previous year, you have to take 10 years, and out of the 10, at least 2 years he should be a resident. And the second additional condition, leaving out the previous year, you are taking the previous 7 years prior to the previous year. So 730 days in 7 years prior to the previous year. For being ordinarily resident, he should satisfy one basic condition and two additional conditions. Only then he becomes an ordinarily resident. And ordinarily resident satisfies one of the two conditions under section 6(1), that is the basic condition, and he satisfies both the additional conditions under section 6(6)(a) and b, that is the two additional conditions that we have seen. So the more important points that we should know when we say about staying in India: anywhere within the Indian geographical territory he can be, not in the waters, Indian waters, not in a ship. He should be on land, and even if it is on a ship, it should be within the Indian border. So in the Indian territory, if he is moored in a ship, even that will be stay in India. Stay may be continuous or intermittent. He need not stay continuously. He can stay continuously, or it can be few days here, few days abroad. It can be intermittent. Stay need not be in one place. He can stay in one place. He can stay in some other place in India. He can be in Bangalore. He can be in Chennai. Anywhere he can be. But it should be in India. So the place does not matter. Object of stay, why he is staying, does not matter. So for the calculation of the period of stay in India, we will say 24 hours in a day will be 1 day. We all know 24 hours is 1 day. So for a person to be staying in India, we will calculate 24 hours as 1 day. When it comes to a Hindu undivided family, again, it can be a resident and ordinarily resident and not ordinarily resident, and a non-resident. All this depends on the Karta, the head of the family. Head of the Hindu undivided family is the Karta. So if the Karta satisfies one basic condition, both additional conditions, then ordinarily resident. If the Karta satisfies one basic condition and does not satisfy any one of the additional condition, he is a not ordinarily resident. If the Karta does not satisfy both the basic conditions, then the HAF is a non-resident. As far as a company is concerned, the company should be an Indian company. The control and management of its affairs should be wholly situated in India. So the control of the company, the management of the affairs of the company should be in India. If not, it is a non-resident company. So for a company, it can be a resident or a non-resident. So when we move on to the residential status of a company, there is no situation as ordinarily resident or not ordinarily resident for a company. It can either be in India or it can be wholly or partially outside India. The management can be in India, it's a resident. If the management of the affairs of the company is wholly or partially outside India, it's a non-resident. Now, for an AOP, the control and management, that is the de facto control and management, should be from India. Then it is a resident. If not, it is a non-resident. So the SSC is classified based on the residential status as resident, non-resident. And if he is a resident, it can be ordinarily resident or not ordinarily resident. So how you will determine the residential status of an individual? So this is how it goes. For determining the residential status, as I already told, the two tests, two basic conditions we are checking. If one is fulfilled also, he is a resident. Then we move on to the two additional conditions. So before going on to the additional conditions, the basic conditions again I repeat: stay in India in the previous year for at least 182 days. Stay in India for at least 60 days in the previous year and 365 days in 4 years prior to the previous years. So there are some situations when the second condition of 60 days is extended to 182 days. So if a person leaves India for the purpose of employment, or if an Indian citizen leaves India as a crew member of an Indian ship, if a person being an Indian citizen comes on a visit to India during the previous year, then the second condition of 60 days will also become 182 days. The additional conditions. So by fulfilling both the additional conditions, they become an ordinarily resident. Resident for at least 2 out of 10 years in the previous year preceding the previous year. Stay in India for at least 730 days in 7 years prior to the previous year. So those are the additional conditions. So to summarize, resident and ordinarily resident, resident and not ordinarily resident, and a non-resident. For resident and ordinarily resident, one basic condition and two additional conditions. For resident and not ordinarily resident, one basic condition plus one additional condition, or one basic condition and no additional condition. For non-resident, no basic condition is fulfilled. So this is me, Dr. Shobha Edward, Principal KCS Kasinada College of Arts and Science, signing off from you. Thank you and have a happy and smart learning.